Baldwin, and I'd like to now introduce you to our panel of experts and those who will help us elaborate on, think about the impact and the possibilities of this piece and what it's meant to them and what it's meant to them with their different expertise in mind. So I think we'll just go in the order in which they sat. I think it actually makes sense to start with the dramatists and then to move on gradually into those who know the mind in all its intricacies and mystery. So first we have Frances Babbage, who is a professor here in the Department of English and an expert in dramatic adaptation. Then we'll have Carmen. I'll introduce her next, but I'll go one by one.
Oh, okay. I made a few little notes before, but they're not, yeah, they're just as a sort of prompt, in case I kind of forget what I was thinking about. So, I guess there's several things that, oh, actually I can't even find my notes. Never mind that, forget that. So, several things really interested me about this. One of the things I sort of came to it interested in was about how far it's possible to hear or kind of understand the voice of Prudy in relation to the figure of Lucas. So that this question, particularly here about sort of marginalised or kind of quieter voices, is something that's interested me for a long time, and I really like that right near the start. I don't know if it's the line that the Gudrun figure spoke, but about Prudy, if we listen, we may hear her too. I was thinking about the way there have been so many writing projects and books published that some of you may know and have come across, like recently Pat Barker's The Silence of the Girls, or Margaret Atwood's The Penelopead. And actually I just saw the other day about a book that I don't think has come out yet, which is Sandra Newman's book Julia, which is revisiting Orwell's 1984 to try to understand what, in this case in work of dystopic fiction, what Julia's perspective on this, in some ways misogynistic story, might have been. And here, just in preparing for this event, I thought about Prudy, and I did a little bit of very quick searching, and I couldn't find anything. The only references I could find to Prudy, this sculptor and this figure, was in relation to F.L. Lucas. And even then, as a bit more than a footnote, but a sort of, was he married 3 times? A sort of the interim wife. I've got no reflection on Lucas. I don't know anything really about Lucas to have any kind of view. But in terms of that narrative and how it's presented, and there's a kind of a Wikipedia page presents a somewhat romanticised image of the third wife, whose name I've forgotten, as the figure who came over the sea when I needed her, and Prudy is just sort of consigned to silence. And I don't know enough about the figures to understand how much in what we watched there, how much was sort of evidential and how much was fiction. But I'm really interested in that joint, that way of drawing on materials and the imagination to bring our perspective of now back to try to understand that story. And I suppose the second thing that interested me particularly about this was, because a lot of my research interests are about adaptation, as what it means to take a journal as a source. And in some ways, because a journal feels like, but it's obviously very different from a fictional source, it seems to have different questions attached to it about authenticity and the personal and what we owe to it in adaptation. But on the other hand, a narrative like a journal is so full of gaps. It absolutely invites and requires that we read into it and add and imagine. So it sort of both has this need for the authentic, but also this need for the imagination and sort of addition and invention. And so that's what I'm really looking at in this adaptation. And, you know, I'm watching it. I was both looking at what was done and trying to imagine a fuller theatrical event and what might happen and what the potential is of these three figures in space, and also their interaction with the screen, which is a lovely device with a lot of potential in the way that it invites us to sort of see the immediacy of people in the room, but also that strange kind of, what word is, sort of retreat when they seem to be something very, very sort of unsettling in the way that you did it just here, where we hear the voice but we see this almost sort of mouthing figure on screen. A very interesting sort of device to play with. And I also love that you used Gudrun, the lovers of Gudrun, as that as sort of, I think there is a need for a third figure, and that's really intriguing to see how that works. I'll stop there because I suspect we're in next to you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Really a lot of things to reflect on there. Now, Carvin Levick, who is also a senior lecturer in the Department of English, a dramatist as well, and we'd like to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the artists, and thank you very much, Nicola and Julie, for inviting me. It was really extraordinary to see such a work dramatised, and just to kind of say a little bit about what my interest is in this piece. My research is kind of in between theatre and literature. I'm looking at the moment at kind of autobiographical writing, so diaries. So I'm looking at diaries that were written not to be published, and I'm looking at diaries from kind of 1930s, 1940s by Jewish people who were living in Eastern Europe, and they wanted to write about their experience. And some of what I heard in the piece really kind of reminded me of, oh, this is, it almost sounded as if this was the other side, talking about the people that I'm kind of looking at. But also what intrigued me was the fact that this, as you do kind of mentioned at the beginning, that this was a diary or a journal written to be published. And it felt like that. It felt like this was very, very kind of careful about what he was saying, what he was kind of presenting, and all this thing about, oh, let's help the Czech, let's do something to kind of, you know, help Czechoslovakia, which was very much a kind of a way of engaging with history and engaging with politics. And this is, in a way, the other thing that interests me, how history and politics impact on everyday life, and how is that then kind of reflected back in diaries and journals. And I think that happened here quite self-consciously in a way, by Clint's kind of talking about, you know, what Chamberlain is doing, or what Hitler is doing at that particular point in time. But I think to me what was really intriguing and important was Prudy's voice, because often in diaries and in journals, those, you know, Francis mentioned, is that there are lacks, there are gaps that are very difficult to fill in, especially when the person who's writing the diary, who's writing the journal, mentions particular people, but then the voices of those people are really missing from any kind of narrative. So I thought it was really important for Prudy to be present, and also it was quite interesting how different to me, while watching the piece, how different were the kind of the way in which kind of Lucas presents Prudy's downfall, Prudy's kind of nervous state. To me, it was a woman who was kind of like saying, okay, I've had enough of this. So I just want to do whatever I want to do. I want to dress the way I want to dress. I don't care what the kind of, you know, the others, what society tells me to do. And this is somehow interpreted as this kind of, you know, nervous breakdown that happens. Well, to me was anything but. Was actually a kind of a becoming to an awareness that was really refreshing, especially kind of reading loads and loads and loads of diaries and journals from this particular period of time, both from here and from abroad, where women are really kind of represented in a particular way, and there's expectations about women. And I thought that Prudy really kind of stood up to that, and was not the way he kind of described her in the journal. So yes, those are the kind of the questions that I kind of forward, this idea of, you know, the private and the public. What do we write? How do we write when we want something to be published? And what happens to the voices that are missing, especially female voices?
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And now we move on to the mental health section of the panel. We have first Dr. Rachel Lightstone, who is a consultant paediatric psychiatrist at Stepping Hill Hospital in Stockport, not far from the Garrick Theatre, in fact.
Thanks Julie for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for that really wonderful production that used to be acted, and I really enjoyed it. You had a few notes, you have no notes, I've got lots of notes. Most of those I scribbled during that production because there was so much coming out that really fascinated me. And it's not surprising I'm coming at this from a totally different angle. I'm not going to lie, this is a little bit outside of my comfort zone. I'm not an academic, I'm not a lecturer, I'm not a historian, I'm an NHS doctor, a jobbing clinician. I work every day seeing young people and families, where there are young people with mental health problems. I spend my day assessing and treating these young people. The bit about my work that fascinates me is seeing a young person not in a bubble, not in isolation, but thinking of them like an onion. And you slice an onion and that patient is at the centre, you've got all these little onion rings all the way around. And those rings represent to me the different aspects of a young person's world. So we don't see patients in isolation, we see them in the context of their family, their friends, social media, their school, their society. And I think what's increasingly obvious for me that the outer rings, more so now than ever, represent sort of the world, global crisis, politics. And I think that watching this, there are so many aspects of Peter and Prudence's story that are mirroring what I'm seeing and the current times. Prudence has, I think I really have a different view to you, that Prudence has what appears to me quite a clear mental health issue, which impacts on her relationship with her husband. But what's really clear from listening to Peter is the environmental and the political unease is contributing to her, but also to how he feels. I don't think Peter has a mental health problem, but he clearly has struggled and has dark moods and feels really quite, anxious about the situation. The aspect of trauma and sort of external triggers impacting on one's mental health is a common theme, and I think I see it in almost every young person that I see. And I think early on in my career, I thought of trauma maybe as very much an individual thing. So I would see maybe a child or a young person who had experienced abuse or bullying or had witnessed something horrific, and that was their individual trauma. This idea of a sort of collective trauma, this world trauma, for me personally, was highlighted on May 2017 when a terrorist walked into the Manchester Arena and blew up a bomb and killing lots of people and injuring lots of people. That was just 1 or 2 miles down the road from where I live and work. And in the immediate aftermath from that, I saw young people who were there who were clearly directly traumatised. But in the weeks and months after, this new phenomenon to me was that there were young people who had no connection to it, who had never been there before, but there was this sense of unease. If this happened, it could happen again. This inability to predict or control, this sort of sense of fear of what might happen. And this unknown is clearly what I think is Peter is talking about, this inability to sort of predict that is heightened that anxiety. And we know that that sort of inability to control and predict creates symptoms of anxiety, low mood, poor sleep, and if they become really troubled, can lead to sort of suicidal thoughts. And obviously since that arena attack, we've had the pandemic, we've had the war in Ukraine and further global crises, And there's increasing evidence that these sorts of crises are having huge impacts on the number of people seeking support for their mental health. But in addition to thinking about sort of this as being all sort of, I guess, illness creating, I think it's really important to look at how Peter and Prudence felt during this time and how it mirrors how people feel now. And that is such a common theme that actually we have to acknowledge this is actually normal. I think it's really important to say that it's understandable and it's okay to be worried when there's really terrible things happening around you. And I think the important thing is to think about this in a sort of maybe a protective way. How can we actually acknowledge, look at this work and think about what's happening now and use that in a protective way in the future? And I think that by watching Peter and Prudence's story, it might help people who are sitting there quietly worrying about what's happening now to actually identify and externalise what they're thinking. Maybe it can open up a dialogue to allow discussions about these sorts of things, help people recognise maybe they're not the only people who experience this, and it might actually be a therapeutic or helpful tool to think about building resilience in the future.
Sorry, thank you very much. That was absolutely brilliant, and you brought out so many of the things we're hoping that we've tried to convey. So thank you for that reflection. Now we have Liat Levita, who is in the Department of Psychology, and we'll talk a little bit more about her research, and has deep interest in this the relationship, I believe, between kind of external trauma and psychology.
Thank you. I need a moment to compose myself. That performance was deeply affecting and inspirational, so thank you all three. I didn't expect to feel the way I feel right now after the performance. And so just to kind of let you know who I am and take some of the wonderful things that you were able to portray on the stage. So I'm a developmental psychologist, and specifically I'm interested in the adolescent brain. And I use different techniques to see how the brain changes through this very, very prolonged developmental period, from the onset of puberty until your mid-20s. And in my lab and the work we do, we're very interested in how life histories and how your experiences really shaped this very prolonged developmental period where your brain still undergoes amazing transformation and structural and functional changes over time. And I very much want to thank you for highlighting really Prudy's story, and like you, I very much feel it is a portrayal of someone in crisis. And I'd like to speak a little bit about that and their relationship also with someone who's older. And if you think about their relationship, she started that relationship as a late adolescent. We have this arbitrary cutoff in society that by the time you're 18, you're done, you're an adult. That is not true. We have amazing brain imaging data, some of this that we acquire from our own lab and others all over the world, that shows that the brain isn't really fully mature until your mid-20s. So we have a young girl really still establishing her identity at university, developing a relationship with someone much older, and that might have been a healthy or an unhealthy relationship. It's so hard to say now what that was and how that could have impacted her, and what life history she brought in to their relationship that could have made her very vulnerable at the time of extreme global challenge, and maybe even relational challenge with her own husband, and things that happened within that of course is close to us. Julie will speak in a minute, but we are a part of a research consortium to look at the impact of COVID-19 on young people and adults, and we've been we would like to maybe tell you a little bit about kind of the story that's emerging from that. So we've got the Second World War, a global crisis. We've all undergoing the global crisis that is COVID-19. And we tend to kind of also have a way of pathologizing this and that experience. And it's very dangerous to do so. So the nervous state might make us believe that every single person in that period or in the COVID period will be adversely affected by what is an extreme challenge. But as you know, in your own practice, that is not the case. People are individuals, and certain individuals may be impacted more. And with young people, especially in my work, I've been very worried about the narrative that all young people would be adversely affected. Whereas we know that there are certain resilience factors that have meant that even though it was challenging and hard and it was upsetting, and that you might have been anxious or in a low mood, that was okay. That was really the appropriate response at the time. You know, negative emotions per se is nothing to be afraid of, right? They are there to protect us, right? You know, you hurt your knee and you put a bandage on and you don't walk for a little bit, and that's good, that's healthy. And so anxiety or anger or sadness might also be like little calling cards. Step back, see what's going on. You might need to protect yourself a little bit. When that becomes a pathology, is that when you come in and your work, amazing work with mental health, and coming really from the actors and the trauma that you were portraying so strongly, really here and on the screen. It's also something I think that we'll talk a little bit about as psychologists about generational trauma. Going back to the Second World War, everybody sitting here has actually impacted it in some way. We know Peter, his experience of the First World War and trauma that he's probably brought into his relationships from that probably affected him quite a lot, and maybe it's unspoken. But also from my own experience, or not my own experience, but familial experience of, obviously, of the Second World War and the Holocaust and what that means and how it reverberates and affects our behaviour and emotions today. Something that might be an interesting topic of discussion. But I would like to pass on now to Julie.
So just let me let everyone know that you're, of course, Julie Gibson Miller, and I think you've already been more or less introduced, but you're working together with the ACTS, but in a more in a clinical capacity. Is that correct as well?
Yes, yes.
So thank you very much.
So hi, thanks for having me and inviting me today. I've been absolutely fascinated by that. I really enjoyed the performance. Thank you. It felt like it got more anxious as the time went on, more tense, and it's just it was really emotional. Thank you. I particularly empathise with Prudy, and this kind of, it felt like she wasn't really being heard, and she was getting louder and louder trying to express herself. I wasn't sure whether she had a clear mental health issue or whether it was her expressing her personality and her maybe dissatisfaction with the relationship and what was going on at the time. But I mean, we need to assess her kind of in a bit more detail. So yeah, I should say I'm an academic psychologist as well as a psychotherapist. So I've got a very small private practice where I kind of meet face to face with people and look at issues to do with trauma, which often, as you found, stem from experiences in the past, but as Leah said, not everybody responds to events in the same way. So we've found in our COVID data that there's separate groups of people who have been particularly affected. As you can imagine, trauma has been particularly high in NHS staff who have been on the front line and have experienced a very different pandemic than some of us. And it just strikes me that there's an inequality that I saw in the performance between the two people in the relationship, and it's not just about their age perhaps, but that feeling that the authority was clearly Peter, because he had the platform and the celebrity, maybe that's not the right word for the 1930s, but just that she struggled to get heard, and was almost, because he was the author and he wrote his words, he had the authority the power in some way to express her story to the audience, and we did hear her voice, but we don't know if that was her story and her expression, or if it's through his voice. He was very, up until November I noticed, very politically minded, talking about everyday things, about bigger universal things between the countries and the build up to the war. And it was quite late on, I'm not sure whether this was in the book or because of the playwright, but just, it seemed he only caught on to what was really happening in a kind of different dimension, in a personal dimension and relationship dimension, later on, that he could actually talk about that and express that. So that did strike me that Prue was pathologised by him, but we don't know what that exactly, how she experienced it and what it was.
Thank you. And it should be mentioned, though, thank you for those brilliant insights. And we should also mention that this whole project has been funded by the University of Sheffield COVID Recovery Fund. So
Yes.
we're all in the same boat in this enterprise in that sense as well. Thank you very much. Please, Donna, would you come forward now? We have our last panelist. Donna Shoesmith-Evans is a history teacher and has brought year 10s and year 12s from her school, and we'd really love to hear your thoughts and reflections, please.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us. Sorry I didn't come and join the panel. I was asking my students, what did you think? What did you get? You know, like you do. So it's an absolute pleasure to sit with you, and also some of the historians study drama, so there was like a double hit on it, so that was good. So I've got my history hat on, and like the third lady on the panel, I'm nothing without my notes. So he started off and he says, we forget how much we forget. It's partly why I write my notes. And I think if there's anything that's come out of this afternoon is the quote, a message in a bottle thrown overboard, like, where do your words go? The idea of keeping a diary is what was really picked up from me. Now, we're a school that's come from Leeds, so one of the lines that was delivered, he said when he'd come back from overseas, England is like the back end of a factory. Now, if you can imagine the train journey we've had from Leeds today, coming along the bottom, I teach industrialisation, so I'm saying to them, look at this. It really is the back end of a factory. So there's things about the performance that resonated from a history point of view. And I think particularly the references, he said he read 6 newspapers a day. How I wish my students read that much. But anyway, Pastor Niemöller, the Bishop of Gloucester's comments that you picked out of, the Jews in August 1938, people were clearly picking things up in newspapers that was not that much censored. Some of these were dated, the Times in September 38. He talked about Mussolini perhaps having the Jews in Abyssinia, the generous scheme. There was some sort of like throwaway things in this that really made me think. He also talked about like the German Dada art. Now, from my historical point of view, my A-level historians might pick up on this. We look at the Bauhaus movement, but the richness of this as a source for these young people, you're looking from different aspects, but as a historian, it's so enriching to have a look at. The idea quote that you said, Hitler may have weapons, and I'm thinking, weapons of mass destruction, I've learned that quite recently. I teach politics as well. So the richness is particularly good. And the World War I experience is picking up what you said of the trauma of the character. I thought was really interesting. I was working it out because it said he was a boy soldier in the Somme, and I'm thinking, sure, he said he was 44, so in this time would he be in about 20s? And again, that illusion was particularly good. Peace for our time. If I teach this now to the students, you delivered it. Peace for our time. My God. And I just thought that passion of a character at the time delivering it is more than a history teacher can who's trying to present it. And the image of Pontius Pilate, of Chamberlain washing his hands, was a fantastic one that I really liked. What is Hitler's psychology? What is he like? And he was described as a super boy scout, which when I teach to the young students, we talk about the Hitler youth and how they were all. I like that image that was particularly used and picked out. And then the statistics, 5 out of 15 million people have been lost from Czechoslovakia. You know, some of the poignancy in there. But for me, really, it was what was the impact of the war on people's life. And it talked about Remembrance Day. The 11th of November 1938 was, we were remembering the First World War. Actually, there was some pogroms going on. And this was published in the newspapers that people knew about. The personalisation I thought was very good from Peter. And you were talking about when did he start moving from his political and historical to his personalisation. I thought this was about Remembrance Day because he said, if war breaks out, and you think, well, what's going to happen? If war breaks out, will I be able to get medicine for it? And that's, I think, when I've thought to myself, he's really seen this through her eyes more than perhaps his academic ones. And then you have that fantastic life. How do history and politics impact on life? So as a teacher, it's my absolute passion that history and politics impact on life. And I thought the performance brought that together. If we were answering a GCSE or A-level question, we'd always get the question, what impact? So I always say to them, socially, what's the impact? Politically, economically. And I thought this production broke out the social side of it, what you called the jungle of unconsciousness, who can tame it? And for me, I am probably more of a social and economic historian. The impact on people of any event, you've talked about COVID, we've talked about the impact of the Manchester Arena, the impact, and just the ending. I did the worst to him. I loved him the best. You always hurt the ones you love most. I love the idea of the personalisation with Prudy amongst this historical drama. So I can't thank you enough, both for writing it and putting it together, for sort of giving it a performance which has a historical resonance as well as others. So on behalf of our young people, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Wow, I'm just absolutely blown over by this panel and each one of your contributions and the cumulative power of these contributions. And of course, it's the greatest endorsement of what Nicola has created here with our three wonderful actors and of course our digital crew as well. I also want to thank Cecilia Tricker-Walsh, who might be dealing with the coffee and cakes, which is a very important task, and for everything she's done too. But I really would like to thank the panel, everyone on the panel, for the most wonderful contribution and for making us feel that we haven't wasted 6 months of our time. But actually, hopefully this is just the beginning of something, I hope, magical. It's already been magical, but it will continue to be magical. So thank you very much to each one of you for your time and for these really, really brilliant insights and for making this project so meaningful in every way. So thank you. I think the last, there's two more elements of this event. One is just, we're going to open things up to Q&A for a few minutes. After that, we're going to invite you to have some refreshments. And while you're having your refreshments, we'd be most grateful. Actually, you have to do it. You're not allowed to leave the room. If you would fill out questionnaires. We have one specifically for the participants and one for the audience members. It's anonymous, so rest assured we don't expect you to reveal yourself. If you'd like to, that's fine, but it is an anonymous questionnaire and it would be very, very helpful to Nicola and to us as we think about the next stage of this. But let's open things up to discussion, if we may. I'll chair the discussion. There's no microphone. It's not such a big room, so I think we'll be fine. Any comments or questions? Yes, Jonathan.
Hi. Two things. Really kind of interested in the idea that what's been presented kind of mirrors in many ways what's going on today. So I think that kind of relevance and connection there.
Can I just, sorry, would the whole cast come a bit closer so we're all together? Nicola, would you come and sit up front as well? Because I'm sorry, I'm thinking of things after the fact. Nicola, here. Just pull your chairs a bit closer. Thank you.
So I'm very, very struck on that, making in particular that connection that you guys brought up around trauma and maybe some of the anxiety, etc., experienced by young people in particular in relation to crises today. And yesterday I came from an event that was looking at the climate crisis and how a big burden of tackling that crisis seems to fall on young people to take action, yet in a situation that could be regarded as hopeless. So I'm kind of very interested in that. I think the second point is I'm just so struck here when we're exploring stuff that has, I suppose, high kind of emotional intelligence attached to it in dealing with the scenario, that it's, well, certainly today, now, it's women's insight and voice that's speaking up about that. And I'm just sort of curious, again, I think in this space where, we have tackling kind of emotional intelligence, it seems to me that there's the, women's solutions to this are very, very much more prominent than men's. Just throwing that out.
Thank
It's
you.
interesting,
Is there
curious
anyone
about
on the
that.
panel, maybe the Prudy herself, anyone who wants to address that? Of course, we'd be happy to hear from anyone. Maybe it was more of a comment. Maybe we'll see if there will
Can I
come
just-
something. Yes, please.
Can I just make one? Look how many women there are on this panel. What a difference from 1938, where really it will be Lucas and his friends. But it is, the lack of diversity is an issue, kind of from a historical perspective. We don't really hear the voices of underrepresented minorities in that time, or women really speaking or being taken seriously. So it's kind of really, thank you for bringing that up. But it's the same now, so in our own work, thinking about the impact of COVID-19 and what is really a global crisis and can be seen potentially for some individuals as a global trauma, whose voices are we not actually hearing from, that we really need to pay attention to. And this is something that I think this story and display kind of brought forward, kind of the voiceless being given a voice by the people that were highly privileged. And they're not necessarily bad, we're just here to hear them too. You know, Lucas himself did suffer. He expresses his love and his sense of hopelessness in dealing with someone with an acute crisis. So we can't forget about his pain, but it's a shame that obviously we are not hearing from the underrepresented majority, actually, in a sense.
I mean, it's especially, you know, the outer layer of the onion of my research has always been about women in this period, and especially around this issue. And I wanted to kind of rediscover Prudy, and I at first didn't want to like Peter, but actually I came to like him a lot more as I realised that, you know, his suffering is quite real, it's quite acute as well. And we're too ready, I think, to assume that he's some kind of patriarchal oppressor, and actually he's suffering too. And I think that's something, you know, that's something that this dramatization has kind of made me, you know, prompted me to really consider. Zoe.
Thank you, and thank you. Those are really, really well done. I mean, I study relationships, and at the moment, sort of relationship strain, and breakups and divorce and stuff in the 70s and 80s. And I just thought it was in the 90s, and I thought it was really interesting watching a couple fall to pieces, basically, through instability of various kinds, because of a direct hit from huge cataclysmic external events. And it just was making me think about how the couples, the testimonies that I look at, there's a lot of huge amount of instability, mental ill health, all kinds of emotions, fury, upset, trauma caused by these like painfully breaking up relationships, and then things to do with children, but also just to do with huge disappointment within relationships. And what you see there is a sort of much more of a kind of monitoring or a vigilance about the relationship, and that the kind of instability and the misery and the unpredictability arises from within that vigilance and from within that dissatisfaction in the relationship itself. So the relationship is a kind of closed system. And so I just thought that's a really interesting contrast with when you see, you know, uncertainty about a world war directly impacting and like sort of causing tension within a relationship. And, you know, it just makes me think about the period that, and the place that I'm looking at and thinking, well, there were cataclysms going on, but not on that level, and the effect is relationships are much more insulated. You don't see couples saying, "God, the strikes are really getting to me." The winter, all these like, you know. So yeah, it's just thought that was really interesting. But again, another comment rather than a question.
Thank you. Any reflections on that? Yes.
I have just so one thing that one of my sort of favourite moments early on was when, I can't remember the exact lines, but there was one of your early sort of Prudy kind of explosive sort of moments, and Peter just kind of gulped and then returned to the journal. There was just a sort of moment of, anyway, press back to the journal, but it just drew attention to, it was about was sparked by what you were saying about the the dynamic between the closed system of the relationship and the external facing, face. But it also made me think about what drama and theatre can do, in that the way that even if Peter is the authoritative figure, going back to what was said earlier, on stage, you have just as much authority or more by your physical presence and the text, but just by your sort of charismatic kind of instability that makes us care about you just as much or more. And so it's a different kind of authority that theatre can sort of bring to bear. You know, I'd be really interested to hear anything about your actorly relationship with the material, and, you know, your sort of changing ways in which all three of you sort of draw attention and then seed it and sort of integrate.
I think Nicola, you wanted to come
Well,
in.
Yeah, I think one of the lines that I picked up on was, I think she says, for men there's always action, women sit. And that line is quite a good line, because she's clearly there and part of it all, but it's like you're saying, how she's sat, she's meant to be passive and not taking part of it, but the woman's voice is so strong and comes out of it really well, and I think there's an awful lot that in like a full performance you could do with that. But that line, I wrote down some ones that I really, and that was one. I thought, yeah, in history actually, it's history, not her story, obviously. Women sit, but they're there. So the voices are there, it's just making sure that they are drawn out and shown in a performance like this.
I have to say, I as a performer find this period of time, especially a wartime theatre, so interesting as a woman. Because I think that I've in the past played other women who have sort of been left behind, so to speak. And I think you're right, like with theatre, it's such a powerful tool because we don't, you know, I really have almost nothing to draw on as Prudy, but in a performance, you know, she's not silent. Even the people that are left sitting sort of in the background, even as the journal is being written or those words are being spoken, you can still exist. And I think that's why it's so wonderful, because you can, I mean, you can say a lot by saying nothing, you know. So and I think women in that period are playing those women as a performer. There's such sort of freedom in a sense, because there isn't a lot that's recorded that you can go off, you know, or you know, you can't watch documentaries about women in wartime in the same way you can watch, you know, stories about men going off to fight. So I think it's yeah, there's a great challenge as a performer.
I just want to come in as partly to say thank you again to everybody, fantastic audience, and really, really brilliant insights. I was really struck by what you said about the different layers, and I just want to kind of throw into the mix that is also true for a text. And I think it's very, very true, absolutely true, because it's his journal. You know, it's F.L. Lucas's story that we get very much from the journal. I think it's also very true that we're getting a very different reading now, and I just want to, in the same way that we say we cannot know, that even though on the balance of probability all of these things may be true, and I absolutely get, and I think we went into it very much as thinking it was kind of Prudy's rebellion, I think to also keep in mind that it is possibly an illness that may have happened anyway, you know, that there was kind of triggers, but it's not necessarily, we can never know, and even after spending kind of a lot of the last year really thinking about them and conversations I've had, I think it's important to remember that to keep that open mind, you know, the more that we dig deeper, and the digging and the process itself, I think that's one thing we feel about the collaboration, the process itself is incredibly useful, but the closer you get, you can't know. I mean, she could have just, in terms of her illness, could have had none of these things happen, and I think there are grounds for thinking that she could well have become well anyway, but obviously under the circumstances of war, anything that was happening and getting access to support, you know, so I'm just, you know,
That's a really powerful point. Can I just say, I know we keep talking about her story, but I really like his story. I'm thankful that he pointed out that Jews were being murdered and prosecuted, and there was a voice and he was saying it. Because just from a personal perspective, in terms of the Holocaust, and that just sort of allowed to happen, and Britain not opening the doors and sending people back to Europe to be burdened by the Nazis, it was nice to see someone from what I would consider the white establishment actually acknowledging that in text. And I know you said maybe he's just doing it to put on the front to seem nice because he knew it was published.
maybe I'm a little bit softer, and I feel there's a degree of genuineness in him that I think the acting brought off really beautifully in having that genuine horror and pointing it out and writing it as an evidence document for future generations to see that this is happening and this is beyond what we can humanly comprehend, and highlighting the psychopathy in Hitler. Maybe not managing to do anything about it, but knowing that that voice existed and probably many other voices existed at the time is a little bit comforting.
He does do a lot about it by being a critic of appeasement.
Yeah.
And then actually, I mean, the fuller story is that he does give his service to the war. It's not to the war opposite, but actually intellectually, and he helps win the war. So he is a hero in the end, even though there's some cloying things about his personality. Ultimately, yes, his story is very compelling as well. As much as we want to find cruelty in this, I think we shouldn't, as I say, dishonour Peter because of some of those kind of sometimes irritating character traits. Well, thank you. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, because talking about Trudy, I'm sorry to keep talking about Trudy, but it really reminded me of a movie called Brief Encounter. And the idea of hearing the woman speak, a woman who doesn't say anything because she has to sit and she has to kind of, be in awe of the husband and to do everything. And the moment we hear her, that's the moment when things start happening and the woman starts to kind of verbalise the problems that she has. But also at the same time, it's the moment when society in general kind of starts pathologising the woman for what she says and for what she kind of expresses. And I think that kind of came out in the piece really well, and it really kind of reminded me of the film.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm having some reflections about voices and representing people, members of society who maybe haven't got a voice, and the responsibility that we've got maybe as researchers to do that. There's another pandemic going on at the moment throughout the COVID pandemic, which is kind of called the shadow pandemic, which is the increase in domestic abuse towards women, especially in minoritized women throughout the pandemic, and we're still dealing with those inequalities in experiences, and the NHS is really strained, and health inequalities have got even worse. So these are really important issues for us to pull out, maybe as privileged researchers, maybe that's our responsibility in our positions.
Making people heard, I think is really key. And you were talking about the climate crisis and the onus of the young people to change the world. I'm just talking to wonderful guys coming here today. Please do, we've messed it up. So, let's learn from history, because here we've got the Ukrainian crisis, and somehow, because they're Christian and white, and I'm sorry that I'm saying this, they're welcome. And yet, the Jewish people were not welcome, and people from warring parts of the world today, from parts of Africa and the Middle East, they are not welcome. We have done nothing from 1938. And it hurts me at the level that it's just impossible to even express. So morning pieces like yours, where we have a voice like Lucas telling people, come on, come on, it is not heard. People are being turned away to die. Very painful.
I think, and not only
Sorry,
that,
I was pushing on.
we've kind of created this sort of vision of this country as somewhere that we all did accept people. And what's interesting about the testimony of the journal is even then they're saying, about shipping people off, and that thing that actually in rehearsals we were going to at one point reduce just for running time, when he describes the journey of somebody getting sent to Belgium, trying to get a passport, getting put in jail, getting out of jail. It's exactly what's happening now. And we feel it's something that's just started to happen this year. We have this kind of narrative that's just happened for the first time. And I think on that basis alone, aside from their nervous state, that we're just perpetrating this, yes, yeah.
And that's the point. We're trying to hear those echoes and see those patterns, aren't we? There's nothing new under the sun in terms of our psychological responses to the world that we live in and the environment that affects us so deeply, I think what is also maybe affecting some people is the need for coffee and cakes. So I'd like to thank the panel once again. I'd like to congratulate the cast and crew for creating this great piece.
And Tom,
And
who made it all
Tom,
work. One thing, although we've been, working on it over a while, that the actors have 1.5 days.
Yes.
With this, since they started.